Thank you, Dan. Thank you to everyone. I appreciate your coming here. I actually have a long history with DNSSEC, going all the way back to its beginning. DNSSEC started in 1993 when in the IETF, the working group was first chartered and the specifications began their design process. And I was chair of that working group throughout its entire lifetime. In fact, back in those days, it was my team back then at a former employer that wrote the first public domain implementation of DNSSEC. So this has been 20 years in the coming, and I guess like IPv6, it'll be around until it's urgent. And hopefully I can convince you that it's a little bit urgent to be into doing this right now. So very quickly, although I have a long history, the company I'm with now, Afilias, we have a long history with DNSSEC too, because they started back in 2008 in beginning to plan for signing TLDs. And in fact, they started with .org, which was their largest TLD. And a year later in 2009, they had signed.org. And then they began the plans for offering signed delegations so that registrars could sell them to individual people, you and I and various citizens, anyone on the internet who had a domain name, so they could sign their domain names too. So that in June of 2010, .org became the first gTLD at the time and the largest TLD with over 8 million records in the domain in the zone to sign the TLD for DNSSEC. And all of this was before the root was signed. So they were really an early pioneer and an early adopter of all of this technology. And then we began the process of signing all the rest of the TLDs, and you can see up here logos from the 16 TLDs that Afilias currently hosts. And we have hundreds more coming with the new ICANN gTLD program. So there's a lot going on in DNSSEC for us. We're going to talk a little bit today about DNSSEC basics. I'm not going to dig into a lot of technical details. You're going to hear much more about that from Jacques, who comes up after me, who's going to tell you about the .ca case study. But there are a couple of things that I want to highlight and talk about here. And then I'm going to talk about what the benefits are of DNSSEC, what it does for itself right now, and what it offers for the internet, what the future is, what the opportunity is, and hopefully motivate you to want to be involved and engaged and deploy it for yourself. So moving on to the basics. So what is DNSSEC? DNSSEC, up here on the slide you see a relatively technical definition of DNSSEC, but in simpler terms it's about taking this thing over here and this thing over here and putting them together and promising you that those things belong together. The DNS, the domain name system, is a mapping protocol. It takes a domain name and it maps it to some data element, usually just an IP address, so that you can find your website or your other internet service, whatever it is that you're looking for, and it puts them together and it offers that information out there for the internet. What DNSSEC does, DNS security extensions, is it promises that that binding is the right binding. And one of the other features that we built into DNSSEC, just to carry forward a feature of DNS, is that binding, you can hand it off to anybody, it can come from anywhere, and you can verify it and you can validate it. Okay? So it doesn't matter what the source is of that binding, as long as you get the binding and you get the signature that goes with it, it's always valid. And that's a critical feature of the DNS caching, and of course, it was important for DNSSEC to carry that forward too. The most important thing to recognize about all this is that DNS is a critical infrastructure protocol. Virtually everything that you do on the internet uses the DNS for all users. You can't go anywhere or do anything without knowing a name and looking up its address. So it's an important building block to everything that we have going forward. This is what the DNS operational system looks like with DNSSEC. Again, you're going to hear more about some of the details about how all of this works when Jacques talks up next, but there are two important things that I want you to see out of this slide. The user down at the bottom is sitting outside of the dashed green box all the way around. The idea here is that DNSSEC represents a cloud, if you will. It's a security cloud. It's a security service that the user simply uses and should simply take advantage of. They're not and should not necessarily have to be an active part of that system, anyone who's using the internet. It's inside that box, the infrastructure, where all of the real work takes place and all the pieces have to come together. And in fact, for those of you in this room who are ISPs, one of the critical roles that you play is in the bottom center of that green dashed box, the thing called an iterative resolver. The place where you can contribute most to the deployment of DNSSEC and moving this forward is to upgrade your iterative resolvers that you're providing for your customers and make that a validating resolver so that all of your customers can take advantage of the security that's provided by DNSSEC and the services and features that end up getting built on it. And of course, if you are providing authoritative servers for some other set of your customers, and I know that many ISPs do that, you'll have a responsibility there to upgrade and move towards signing services and providing that for your customers. So who are all the players that are involved in deploying DNSSEC and having it be a reality? Well, the largest part of the provisioning system is the domain registration system. And Jacques is going to talk about that next also. He's going to give you the case study for .ca. There are a lot of players in that business too. The registries, such as ourselves, Afilias. You have registrars, the registrants, those people who own the domain names. As ISPs, if you offer authoritative name services, then you're part of the second community. You're part of the domain name system as a whole that serves the internet as a whole because you are one of the DNS operators and you have an important role in that particular place for supporting DNS security. And of course, you have a community role because you have to provide the validating resolver that allows the users, the applications, the web browsers, and other services to take advantage of DNSSEC. So moving on, what are the things that we get from DNSSEC? Well, originally, when the security extensions were put together, the primary goal was about protecting the DNS data itself. So you wanted to be able to provide this binding and ensure that you could promise it was the right binding. This really became mainstream news a few years ago when Dan Kaminsky demonstrated that you could easily take advantage of cache poisoning and you could do cache poisoning attacks on a scale, on an internet-wide scale level, and it was fairly straightforward to do. And so that was one of the things that made DNSSEC very important and motivated its another movement forward in trying to see deployment. But DNSSEC is really more than that. I mean, protecting the DNS itself is an important component, but that's because DNS is really a building block, and DNSSEC is an essential and critical cornerstone to building the next generation of safe and secure internet. You really need this in order to succeed at anything else. There are so many things that you can do, and even things that we probably haven't even thought of yet as far as moving forward with the DNS. And the reason why this is important is because without DNSSEC, you never really know if you're getting where you want to get to. I can have a label and I can have an IP address, but unless I've got that promise that that binding is the right one, I never really know if I'm getting to where I want to get to. Okay? But of course, most people are going to look at this and they're going to say, but wait a minute. I have TLS. I have my web browser. I get to see a green bar or a blue bar or a little padlock up there, so I must be secure. But my question to you is, quick poll of the audience, how many people are actually looking at the certificates that TLS is based on? Anybody actually look inside the certificates? I saw a hand go up in the back, but that's not fair because you're a speaker. So I know you're already there. Another one over here on the side, good. The certificate infrastructure is separate from the DNS, so it's a wholly separate thing, which means you have to verify it and check it separately. So what TLS gives you, what TLS SSL and what you're getting from your web browsers when you see that padlock or green bar, blue bar, and other things, you're getting a good encrypted tunnel. So you're seeing confidentiality. You're knowing that no one is listening to what you're doing, but there really is a little bit of a gap there on your endpoints, okay? And DNSSEC provides you an opportunity to increase the assurance that those endpoints really are the right place, that you really are getting to the right server. So DNSSEC and TLS are really complementary. You need them both to begin to build on a safe and secure internet and to grow your opportunity. So let's take a look at what I can do if I have these two things and I have this building block. What you get from DNSSEC is the opportunity to build more trusted domains. Once I have the opportunity to take these two elements, I can take a domain name, right, and I can map it to something. So I can map it to the name of the website. I can know that the website name is www, .example.info. I can know that that name exists, and somebody's not lying about what the name might be. Okay? You can tell with DNSSEC if a name doesn't exist. And once I know that they're bound together, I can look for the IP address of that website, and I can know that I can get there. And then with TLS, I can build a nice encrypted tunnel, which is very useful if I'm looking at my private information on the internet, if I'm looking at my financial services and I'm doing my banking online. So I get extra assurance. And another step in building the internet that I really want to have. Okay? That's the goal that we're after here. Of course, nothing that sounds as good as all of that is ever easy. There's always challenges. So there's always things that you have to get past. Security, by definition, increases the baseline of expertise that you need. And we're all going to bear the cost of that. Every enterprise who wants to do things securely, as a service provider who wants to offer secure services, who wants to do things securely even in your own environments, you're going to have to find people who understand the technology, can manage it for you, deploy it, and of course, facilitate your customer support personnel when you do have comments and concerns from your user community. There are issues with DNSSEC that really are kind of challenging. Key management is a subtle issue. It can be very challenging to get that right and manage the keys that are used for signing that binding that makes it work. But we're moving along. We're building tools that make that simpler and much easier. So there are a lot of software options out there. So these are things that you can look for and take use of in your own environments. There's a lot of public domain software that can help you. One new thing that this innovation has created for us, though, is this new relationship between DNS operators are now they have a role in the domain registration system. In order for DNSSEC to work, you have to get a key into the registry system, which means now you're not just a DNS operator who can serve authoritatively DNS information. If you're offering signing services, you're creating keys to do that. And you have to get that key into the domain registration system in order for it to be available to be distributed throughout the rest of the internet. That's actually a key technical issue which does not have a standard solution today. Okay? It's still something which is under experimentation. There are a number of options out there for doing it. But you as ISPs who provide validating resolvers, you as ISPs who provide DNS authoritative services to your customers, you now play an essential and critical role in the success of DNSSEC. So it's important for you to really look at this information. You'll find out when Ja comes up to give his talk that they have some things to offer to you. They have some help they can provide to Canadian businesses and Canadian industries. So there's an opportunity for you to get a kickstart in moving forward and providing this internet that we're all looking for. So how do we create a greater demand for DNSSEC beyond just having presentations like this and telling people? I think we're past the early adopter stage, right? We're past the pioneers. If anything, we're sort of at the tail end of early adopters. Didn't move forward. At tail end of early adopters. In terms of legislated compliance, we have something close to that today in the ICANN community. I mentioned earlier the new GTLD program. I mean, there's going to be 1,000+ new TLDs that are coming into existence over the next couple of years. But one of the things that's interesting about those new TLDs is they are required to be signed. So they're required to offer DNSSEC. So hopefully that will provide an extra boost. They're not, unfortunately, required to offer signed delegations, but it's fair to say that many of them will. Certainly all of the TLDs that we host will, and I know that there are other significant registry providers that will ensure that their TLDs that they launch offer signed delegations and make them available. And that's important. So what we really are is in the early stages of registrant and user interest. And again, this is an opportunity for ISPs, and this is a role that you can play. The first step, of course, is offering a validating resolver. So even if you're not offering signing services yourself, you can at least facilitate your community having access to a more secure internet. Okay, allowing your community to have the opportunity to take advantage of new applications and new innovative services that use DNSSEC, and so that they can start using these new tools and thus motivate more people to want to have their own domain name signed. And then they'll push back on their domain registration service providers to ensure that that service and facility is available to them. So what else is next here? An important part in all of this is, given that DNSSEC, like really any security service, there are certain complexities. There are certain things that are hard. They require specialized skills. Well, last week at the IETF, I heard a phrase from Bruce Schneier. He offered this comment that one-click DNSSEC, he said one-click security is too complicated. And I realized, as I stopped to think about it, that that's a nice goal. That really is an interesting statement. It's an important one. The problem with security is we're always trying to involve so many people and so many players in it. It really has to be easy. It has to be possible for a user to do this, or a registrant to do this, and really it should be nothing more than one click in the worst case. The goal to aspire to is to do DNSSEC by default. Don't even let them click. They shouldn't have to. Right? If you find a DNS operator who does it and a registrar who offers it as part of their services, and it should just work. For the ordinary user who's sitting there at their browser or other application or service, again, they shouldn't have to do anything. It should just work. So I think that that's important. We have to centralize all this complexity and pull it into the infrastructure and protect the broadest user community, and thus allow innovators, allow people who have new ideas about how to build a safer and more secure internet the opportunity to do this and to get it done. And just in case you were thinking that you really didn't have to care about being a part of building a more secure and safer internet, last week was the IETF meeting, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And for those who don't know the IETF, it is the leading standards development organization that's responsible for the standards that make the internet work. They had a technical plenary last week. I'm sure that Dan is going to be talking a lot more about this later, but I want to make one point out of this. The engineers, the IETF community that was in that room at that time, all collectively agreed that pervasive monitoring is a threat to the internet. And we've known all along, you've always heard stories in the recent past about countries in particular, but you know, even enterprises and other nefarious folks who do a lot of monitoring of activities on the internet. And we found out now from Snowden and the revelations that came up after it, of course, that even the US is actively engaged in these kinds of activities on a fairly grand scale. So when I was talking before about the complement of DNSSEC and TLS, you know, the importance of that and building that into application services as we know them today, and then looking for those new opportunities in the future has never become more important. And this is the opportunity, this is the time. What those engineers agreed to is that we really do, in evaluating all of our existing protocols and practices, and we have to look for the gaps, the opportunity to do new things in order to better protect everyone and all users of the internet. Okay. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions, I guess, if I have some time. Dan? Anybody?
Thanks, Jim, and you do have some time, so if we do have questions, are there questions for people out here? Over there, John. It's coming to you. It's coming to you.
Maybe I have loud enough voice.
Not loud enough for the internet.
I'll repeat the question, but...
Okay. We've heard about DNSSEC for a number of years now. To the end user, will he see a difference? Will the browser make a DNSSEC request to the resolver? Or at what point does the chain get complete so that everything is DNSSEC?
So you're right. For DNSSEC to really be valuable, as with any security service, the closer that you can bring it to the user, the better. And what you really need in this system is for your browsers, your mail systems in particular, any kind of service to do its own DNSSEC validation, to do the validation of the records. So the system is not closed until the browsers actually incorporate that into their system and their applications. But browsers can't do that or depend on it until the validating resolvers are there, right? They don't have that opportunity unless they want to build their own resolvers into their application. And that, again, is where this community in particular, as ISPs, you play a critical role in supporting the innovation of these new services and integration of those things for users. My personal bias about users is users should never know the difference, because it should be possible for applications to do the right thing. If certificates have taught us anything about browsers, it's that users don't care about error messages and pop-ups. You know, did you really want to go here? I don't think I trust this certificate. You really need to set things up so that that goes away. It's either secure or it's not, and you end there. Thank you. There's a question over here, Dan.
Hey, great presentation. I just wondered if you had any viewpoints on some of the actual security issues involved with deploying DNSSEC, for example, the amplification attacks and some of the enumeration vulnerabilities, zone enumeration vulnerabilities that can happen once you've implemented DNSSEC.
So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. You want to know about
Well, I didn't see any points. There was nothing discussing the challenges some operators, as operators, we might face, for example, the amplification attacks we could be subject to, or the zone vulnerabilities where people can enumerate them. Even with NSEC 3, you can still actually walk a zone and get everything. I didn't really see any of those points discussed, and as service providers, I think a lot of those are valuable to us. So your thoughts on them and where we're going to solve those, really?
Well, you don't necessarily have to support zone walking or allow it if that's your concern, right? I mean, between NSEC and NSEC 3, the fundamental difference is that with NSEC 3, you can't walk the zone. And it came along later in the life of DNSSEC. It came along actually shortly after 2000 or so, when we really started to look at that issue, when privacy became a much more important and made more mainstream news. Do I think it's important? You know, we do NSEC 3 in all of our zones, but it's a choice that you can make for yourself. I would suspect that many TLDs will probably do NSEC 3 and also do what's called opt-out, so that you can only see the secure part of the zone. They sort of ignore everybody who hasn't implemented DNSSEC. And that's important for large zones because otherwise things just get too large. There is an investment in DNSSEC. You'll hear more of this from Jacques when he talks. But you're right, as you move forward, it increases, there's some increase in bandwidth usage, so there's some performance impact. But all of these things can be planned for, and you can scale for this. And I would expect an ISP to ordinarily have headroom anyway. So, you know, it would just be an ordinary part of upgrading to get there. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Another question in the back?
So Medica KO IID, I just want to make the comment that when people are worried about DNS amplification attacks, what I would encourage everybody, especially in this room, being an ISP, to do is ingress filtering, right, and anti-spoof filtering. Because it's not really the larger packet sizes, as in DNSSEC or other issues that can be circumvented, that are the problem. The biggest problem is that people do not deploy anti-spoof filtering. And so I would really encourage people to look at deploying secure protocols, because that is where we need to get to, and provide mitigation techniques for attacks where you know, best practices exist.
So, thank you, Mara Kay. To add just a little bit more context to her comment, yeah, one of the things that's interesting about DNSSEC is because it makes responses to queries that much larger, so it takes more bandwidth to respond to things, the DNS then becomes an unwitting victim in a denial of service attack. Okay, so people can do queries and they can lie about the origin of that query. And thus, as an authoritative service provider, and even we at Afilias, I mean, we have one of the largest DNS infrastructures. We see these things every day, and there are others here in this room who are quite large and see this too. You know, they'll lie about the origin of a query so that the response goes to some poor, unwitting person. Now, for the most part, we absorb a lot of that traffic, but that little website down in the corner can't always absorb all those responses coming at them. And that's what she's referring to. So the issue here is you play a role in that too, because one of the things that you can do as an ISP is your ingress filtering. So you can be sure that no traffic that leaves your network, okay, has a source IP address that didn't come from your network. Unless you're providing transit traffic, okay, you need to ensure that no one is lying about the source of some query that they're sending out there on the internet. And that will make a huge difference in denial of service attacks. It will have an extremely positive impact, and it will be noticed throughout the world. Because there's really nothing that we can do as an unwitting victim and an unwitting participant in this about these kinds of things. They're very difficult problems to deal with. So it'll help botnets in general in many things. So thank you, Mary Kay. Any other questions? Our microphone was taking a break and having a conversation elsewhere.
As we all aware that the world is quickly awaiting with technology, we have competitors out there. How safe our financial industries or market with using the DSSEC protection, and what are the benefits in case hackers or scammers try to get hold of your information?
So I'm not sure I heard all of that. You're asking about financial services industry and their deployment of DNSSEC?
Yes.
And why they haven't or have not done it?
Because there are so many competitors out there. How safe is it? Is it a benefit to the financial industry market, or is it not a benefit towards that industry? Or how, in case an attack from some of the cyber network, what are the procedures you take in case using the DSSEC software or the installation?
Financial services are an interesting case study in all of this, because the reality is they've done an awful lot, even in the absence of DNSSEC, to enhance their own security. The standard, the gold standard in financial services is two-factor authentication. And really anyone of any significance or size, that's what they're doing. So it's their way of adding a level of authentication inside the encrypted tunnel that TLS provides. So they're providing a solution to this problem without DNSSEC. And they had to do that. You know, I mean, they've been doing this for years. So they really had deployment ahead of DNSSEC. Could you have this chicken and egg problem? So they're kind of ahead of the game in all of that. And that's just a function of where we are, unfortunately. You know, I mean, you just don't have broad deployment of DNSSEC. I mean, they could sign their zones, and then they would have to begin the process of, you know, rebranding their security services. But even to do that, they'd want the browsers to be functioning in a certain way in order for that to work. So there are some infrastructure pieces that are not present for them to just migrate, because they've already solved their problem to a large extent. You know, they've helped themselves. But hopefully in the future they'll move towards this. As folks such as yourselves deploy validating resolvers and they become more ubiquitous, they'll have a greater opportunity to take advantage of that. We have another question back here? No? Andrew, you sort of have your hand half up. No? Anyone else? Okay. Dan, thank you.